Hello, friends, and welcome to Science Talk. I am your host, Jim Massa. I want to discuss with you this article that appeared in the Yale Environment 360 publication, which is associated with the Yale School of the Environment. So what we're going to discuss here. You see here, this is a fishing vessel. This is a Chinese fishing vessel that is equipped with an array of lights, and which are used to attract squid at night. This one happens to be anchored in South Korean waters. Now, China's expanding fishing fleet is depleting the world's oceans. After exhausting areas close to home, China's vast fishing fleet has moved into the waters of other nations, depleting fish stocks. More than seafood is at stake as China looks to assert itself on the seas and further its geopolitical ambitions from East Asia to Latin America. I'm going to be concentrating on the science, on the fishery stocks, more so than the geopolitical aspects. I'm an oceanographer. I'm a fisheries biologist, fisheries oceanographer. That's what I know best. Let's put it that way. I'll leave the geopolitical analyses to the political scientists, if you will. So, and this, by the way, is a report written by Ian Urbina, and this person did some investigative reporting for NBC News, looking at new satellite data that want to know why were corpses of North Korean fishermen washing up along the coast of Japan. And what they found, the most likely explanation is China is sending previously invisible armada of industrial boats to illegally fish in North Korean waters, forcing out the smaller North Korean boats because you have a little boat there and you're trying to go up against these large industrial vessels that can scoop up a huge amount of fish with a trawl. It's going to be difficult. And when you can factor in you're paying off the boat, you have a crew to pay, you have to pay for fuel, you can quickly go bankrupt if you're a small operation. That's basically what's happening. And then, as a result of these activities, a decline in once abundant squid stocks of more than 70%. That is not sustainable. I'll tell you that right off from the get-go. The North Korean fishermen washing up in Japan apparently ventured too far from shore looking for squid and probably encountered less than favorable oceanic conditions, probably with a smaller boat, and they were at risk and they probably went overboard, drowned, what have you. More than 700 Chinese vessels, and they appear to be in violation of United Nations sanctions that prohibit foreign fishing in North Korean waters. These sanctions were imposed in 2017 in response to the country's nuclear tests, were aimed at punishing North Korea by not allowing it to sell fishing rights in its waters in exchange for valuable foreign currency. Okay. Then let's get the geopolitical aspects. Well, I wanted to mention that as a possible reason for China taking advantage of the situation. Estimates of the total size of China's global fishing fleet varies. From some estimates, China has anywhere from 200,000 to 800,000 fishing boats, which is about almost half of the world's fishing activity. The Chinese government says its distant water fishing fleet, those vessels that travel far from China's coast, is approximately 2,600. Other research, such as a study done by the Overseas Development Institute, ODI, puts this number closer to 17,000. With many of these ships being invisible, apparently they have some way of not being picked up on radar. By comparison, the U.S. distant water fishing fleet has fewer than 300 vessels. Well, there's something to be said right there for that. Due to the Magnuson-Stevens Act that's enacted in the mid-'70s, the U.S. has what's called a 200-mile exclusion zone. I think it's called the economic exclusion zone. And basically what that says is that only U.S. Vessels will fish in waters 200 miles from our coast. Of course, that gets violated all the time. It's difficult to enforce, but that's why. Remember where the productivity of oceans tend to be. Not in the middle of the ocean. You have gyres out in the middle of the ocean. Gyres are biological deserts. The productivity there is very, very low. You're going to find most of your productivity on what we call upwellings along the shelf. Upwellings up the slope onto the shelf. We'll call onshore Ekman processes, for example, that bring in nutrients from deeper water. But the point of it is most of oceanic productivity will be found on the continental shelves. When you start getting over to the slope and to the open ocean, to the over the Hadal zone, stuff like that, you're not going to find much productivity. And it's due to the physics. So it really makes no sense to travel way out into the middle of the ocean because you're really not going to encounter much. Most of what you're going to encounter is going to be on the continental shelf. And especially when you look at the eastern seaboard of the U.S., it has a very wide continental shelf, which is favorable for fish productivity. And indeed, when New England was being first settled, you had those vast fisheries, going all the way up to maritime Canada, Newfoundland, and so forth. And what's happened to those fisheries? In the early 90s, they collapsed to the point where the Canadian government shut down the Newfoundland fisheries. Fish stocks around the world, but especially off the eastern seaboard, basically depleted, overfished. Basically, almost everything harvested. So China is the world's largest seafood exporter. The country's population accounts for more than 1/3 of all fish that is consumed around the planet. So and this is a typical pattern. It's not just it's not just only unique to China. It happens all nations. You overfish what's close and nearby, the stuff that's easier to get, and you just keep moving further and further out. Well, it gets harder and harder to catch stuff as you move further and further out because the population has already been depleted. So now you have to start thinking, okay, are enough of the adults surviving to reproduce? Is there enough recruitment, what we call year class strength, of the younger year classes of the fish population that will be able to grow and replenish the numbers? And what we're finding is the answer is no, it is not. Very few fish are making it to adult to spawn, to reproduce. And of the fish that do make it to adult, they're smaller in size. The short of it is we're putting too much pressure on the available resources. Fish stock, doesn't matter if it's vertebrate fish stock or invertebrate fish stock, are being overfished, overharvested. And why is that? Because there's too many people on the planet. I've discussed this countless times before, that the carrying capacity for humans on this planet is between 100 and 600 million. We are now over 8 billion people. There's simply too many people on a finite planet with finite resources to keep this sustained. That's just the cold, hard truth of this all. Here's an interesting thing. Most Chinese distant water ships are so large they scoop up as many fish in 1 week as local boats from Senegal or Mexico might catch in a year. And then what does that leave for say, the Mexican fishermen to catch? So the Chinese ships are basically in Latin American waters. They're targeting forage fish, which are then grounded into fish meal. And then that is usually fed to aquaculture fish, or sometimes, put into other products that you might find in the supermarket. They've also focused on shrimp, and now they're targeting the totoaba fish, which is endangered. Supposedly, there's medicinal properties of their bladders, and the bladders are referring to the gas bladders, which Telios fish use to regulate buoyancy. But China is really dominant in squid fishing. The country's fleet accounts for 50 to 70% of the squid caught in international waters. Basically, that's controlling the global supply. So to catch the squid, they use trawling nets that are stretched between two vessels. Now, this is a practice that is criticized because it's what's called inadvertent, unintended harvesting. In other words, you are scooping up everything in between there. You're not targeting the target species, and you then have what's called bycatch, and these organisms are killed. So let's see. Let's skipping over the geopolitical stuff here. So locally, it's a money losing business. China is hardly the worst offender when it comes to subsidies, which conservation say, along with overcapacity of fishing vessels and illegal fishing, is a major reason the oceans are rapidly running out of fish. It never fails to boggle my mind how the very large corporations, whether it's fishing corporation, oil corporation, are able to get huge subsidies, which are taxpayer dollars, subsidies they do not need, but they get them. That's because corporations control the politicians. Now, the Chinese government has called for a cease for the expansion of its distance water fishing fleet. They released a 5-year plan in 2017 that restricts the total number of offshore fishing vessels to under 3,000 by 2021. Daniel Pauly, a marine biologist and principal investigator for the Sea Around Us project at the University of British Columbia, says he believes that the Chinese government is serious in wanting to restrict its distant water fleet. Whether they can enforce the planned restrictions onto their fleet is another question. It's like asking polluters to police themselves and not polluting, right? Other attempts to rein in the fishing fleet has been slow. Reform's been slow, so on. Chinese fishing boats are notoriously aggressive and often shadowed, even on the high seas or in other countries' national waters, by armed Chinese Coast Guard vessels. So that sounds like there's almost a military support for those activities. So nowhere is China's fishing fleet more on the present than in the South China Sea, which is among the most hotly contested regions in the world. Look at some of the recent U.S. naval activities there. There's a lot of provocations going on there. That is concerned because it doesn't take much to start a conflict over a misunderstanding or something. In the South China Sea, the Spratly Islands have attracted most attention as the Chinese government has built artificial islands and reef and shoals in these waters, militarizing them with aircraft strips, harbors, radar facilities. Chinese fishing boats bolstered the effort by swarming the zone, crowding, and intimidating potential competitors. So here's a photo of a South Korean squid fisherman who is in the East Sea of Japan. They're being forced to fish farther off their own coast by the influx of the Chinese vessels. So what we have here is aggressive overfishing, and I'm not doing this just to criticize China. Um, any overfishing, aggressive overfishing, is not a good thing. It's not a good thing for the ecosystem. It's not a good thing for the overall health of any food web. It still comes down to the fact that there are too many people on the planet, and to as the pressure increases to feed more and more people, we are using up more and more of the available resources. Eventually, things will be totally depleted, and there will be nothing left at all to harvest from the seas. And at that point, we're going to have mass starvation. That's just that's just the blunt reality of it. As I said before, most of the productivity is over the continental shelves, not over in the deep middle of the ocean. And when you take into account year class strength, the fecundity, which is defined as number of eggs a gravid female produces, most marine organisms have what's a 95% mortality. In other words, let's say you have you spawn 100,000 eggs. Of those 100,000 eggs, 95,000 will die because they're food for other organisms. So when fishery biologists factor in their management plans, they create their models, but usually they're assuming what the mortality is. Now, the mortality could be natural mortality, which will include, just dying from genetic defect, some illness, natural predation, and there's also fishing mortality. Now, there's the mortality caused by people harvesting the fish. So they worked this in a model, and they try to come up with values saying, okay, we need at a minimum to let these number of adults survive so that they can reproduce and keep the population in good condition. When you start overfishing in the ocean and less adults make it to breeding age, coupled with the high mortality rates, you're going to have less and less fish in the population. What's the 0-year class is the fish that are born in the year that they hatch. They haven't made it to 1 year of age yet. They are going to suffer a 95% mortality. Whatever of the 0-year class makes it to the 1 year class, they're still small. They're still subjected to predation. So oftentimes, as you work your way up to 2 and 3, 4, 5-year classes, depending what the species specific that you're looking at, you might have had over 99% of all the eggs that were spawned dead, leaving a scant 1%. Now, this works well in an ecosystem where humans are not overharvesting. But you factor in humans overharvesting things, and the population will quickly deplete. Couple that with the overpopulation of humans on the planet, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to understand how this is not sustainable. Fisheries will collapse, humans will starve, the ecosystem will not recover for many, many centuries. This is a serious problem. Putting aside the geopolitics, from a scientific point of view, this is a serious problem. Yes, there's some geopolitical stuff going on. If you want to, you can go to e360.yale.edu/features/ how China's expanding fishing fleet is depleting the world's oceans. So you can go to that URL, you can pause the video and put it up here, and then you can read through the article. And if you want to get further details on some of the geopolitical aspects, I wanted to do this video to point out the issues of overfishing. Thank you for your time. Hello, folks. This is Jim here with Science Talk, asking you to please subscribe to my channel and to inform others of my channel and of the work that I do. Please share to social media platforms that you use. Also, as a reminder, don't forget to click the bell so that you know when I load up more videos. Finally, I ask that you support the work that I do by becoming a patron at patreon.com. Details in the description box below. Thank you for your support.